Welcome to another show of Walk With Me. This is in the Philippine Islands. I met my son Damon Cole in Manila. Here we are. I came from Eugene, Oregon, where I live, and my son lives in Ecuador and is married to an Ecuadorian woman, and he flew from Quito, Ecuador to Manila. We have come to explore some of our family history. First of all, we go out to a very nice casino for some coffee and then take a tour of the historic downtown Manila. This is in the cathedral. It was built by the Spanish. The Spanish were here for 300 years. These are sights on the street. A bamboo bicycle for rent. This is a photo of my parents before they were married. Henry A. Burgess is courting Mary Hayden in Washington, D.C. Shortly after this photo was taken, he left and didn't see her again for 3 years and 3 months. Henry went off to war. He served in the Philippines and he participated in the Battle of Manila to take Manila back from the Japanese. This is a picture of the Battle of Manila and a memorial to the Battle of Manila, the innocent victims of the battle. And then we took a tour over to the Fort Santiago. The Chinese were here, the Spanish, Great Britain, United States, Japan. In 1898, Theodore Roosevelt came and liberated the Philippines from Spain, and then they paid $20 million to Spain for the Philippines. We're getting a tour of the old fort. This was a golf course outside the walls by the Americans. These are bullet holes left by the Japanese when they slaughtered a lot of Filipinos. They lined them up against the wall and then they threw them out into the bay right outside here. This is the old fort today. The Americans fought the Filipinos to possess or annex, as it said, the Philippines. 4,500 Americans were killed in this war. At least 20,000 Filipinos were killed, and another 100 to 200,000 people died of famine by the scorch and burn policy of the United States. The dungeon was built to store arms and gunpowder in 1599. In 1715, it was converted to a prison facility. The Japanese slaughtered 600 Filipinos and stuffed them into these dungeons. One afternoon, we went over to Rizal Park, a memorial to a writer and journalist, Jose Rizal, who was executed by the Spanish for writing and speaking out against the Spanish colonization and cruelty in the Philippines. Here's a reenactment of the execution.
Unahan ng kabataang mag-aalay ng kanilang mga bintuang oras, mga pangarap at mga panghikalan. Halina kayong hinihintay namin. Maglalaho akong lubusan. Papanaw akong nang hindi nasisilayan ang pagmamadaling araw.
The people who fired the guns were Filipinos. The Spanish made them execute him because they said, if you don't shoot him, we will kill all your families. These are statues of Jose with a Spanish captor and a Spanish priest in the background just before his execution. You can go up and touch his hand. You can see many people have polished that bronze with their hands. The park has many statues of previous leaders in the Philippines. This is in Manila. We stopped by the Museum of Fine Art to see some of the beautiful artists. My son and I took a taxi ride out along the bay. This is where my father would have come ashore in Amtrak's amphibian vehicles to rescue the internees at Los Banos University. The Japanese had put thousands of Americans in camps during the war. Here's a picture of the Amtrak vehicles. They were bringing these ashore to take out the prisoners, the internees. These people were all civilians. They were nuns and priests and wives and families of executives of the gold mines and of Montgomery Ward. Here's a map of the camp the Americans had. We took a copy with it. There's the memorial to the internees here and to the rescue by the United States. My father, Henry Burgess, led this rescue. This is the memorial in back of the building and my son leaning against it. That sword is the Philippine fighting sword. This map shows a trench 6 feet deep, 5 feet wide that was dug for the bodies of all the internees who were going to be shot the very morning that they were rescued. These are pictures of the dormitories where the internees were kept. They were confused by the noise and the people, so they went into their dormitories and the Americans had to burn the dormitories so they would come out. This is the field where the dormitories were located. It's now beautiful playing fields for soccer. Nice fountains, nice memorials. This is the campus and my son, Damon, at Los Banos University where the internee camp was. And then we walked around the grounds. We thought maybe back up in these woods was where that trench was dug to put all the bodies of the Americans in. And my sketchbook entry for the day. We did find the Japanese guardhouse. It is still there. The Americans snuck up the river, some of the soldiers, and they threw smoke bombs into this guardhouse so they wouldn't see the Americans dropping in by parachutes right into the middle of the camp. This was and is an agricultural university. This building was here. This is a photo of the internees being rescued and taken out on those Amtrak vehicles to safety. My father, Henry Burgess, received a Silver Star for leading this operation. This is his picture after the war. And then he married my mother after the war, and here we are, 6 kids later in Sheridan, Wyoming on their first ranch. Apology for the poor quality of the photos, but that's what I have. My son and I returned to Manila and went to a nice little restaurant. It could have been Chinese or I don't know what it was, but it was all right. It was pretty good. We got something interesting. We undressed her and threw the meat into a boiling pot. Then we ate it with spices. And then we went down to a dive and trek resort and went snorkeling and scuba diving and had 4 nights here. It was really fun. It was just before Christmas. This is where we were staying. Beautiful, beautiful diving here. And here's our dive master, Jimmy. It was just spectacular. These aren't my photos. My son took some of the photos. On our drive back to Manila, we stopped at the crater of Taal Volcano, Taal. There was a bitter battle fought for a month in here against the Japanese. My father was in that battle. They parachuted into this countryside, and 2 weeks later there was a volcanic eruption. And we stopped at a market on the way into Manila. They had all sorts of local fruits and vegetables, and I was so surprised to see a package of grapes from California. From Manila, we took a bus into the mountains to the town of Baguio. I suffered an ear injury from the diving and went to see a doctor, ear, nose, and throat doctor, and it cost me $4. And then he got me some medication and I was just fine. We walked around the campus of Brent School in Baguio, where my mother and her brother and sister went to boarding school. It's now a school for Chinese who come to learn English. From Baguio, we took a bus to the next town up, Bontoc. It was an all-day trip. This is the view from the jeepney that we took up to the next town, Malikong. Somebody sitting on the roof. This was our hostess, Rowena. She gave us fish head broth soup for breakfast, and her nephew, who's 21, came to be our guide on a walk through the rice terraces. My mother would talk forever about the rice terraces of the Philippines and show us photos. She lived in the Philippines with her parents in 1923 when she was 3. Her father was a visiting professor from the University of Michigan, where he was a professor. When my mother went to Brent School with her brother and sister, they would come up to the rice terraces, and they did a great hike up here. My mother, all the time I was growing up, talked about the Philippines and the rice terraces, so we were thrilled to come visit. This struck me as one of the quiet places in the world. There's not a road up here. That's a little village that has electricity to it, but the children have to walk out to go to school. The day we were here, that we couldn't go to the village because it was the equinox and they were making offerings to the rice gods. If you look carefully in this picture, you can see 3 water buffaloes, or carabao as they call them. There's another shot of the village. Our hostess, Rowena, told us that many of these people live into their 90s. They simply eat rice and vegetables their whole life. They never get in a car. There's no pollution and no politics. In the distance, those are rice storage sheds. I asked our young guide if he wanted to be a rice farmer, and he said no. It is very hard work, and you are always in poverty. He is going to school in Bontoc, studying to be a teacher. There was no need to wander off the trail and get my boots wet, but of course, we did. Well, who needs a carabao or water buffalo when you have women? They'll do the work. And here we see rice drying on the street. That's a traditional bamboo woven mat there. I just think it's all interesting. And we're walking back up to our little homestay with Rowena, who had fed us fish head soup for breakfast. We decided to walk the 3 miles back down to Bontoc, where we would get a bus to Sagada or a jeepney. We are walking back into Bontoc, and you see that bridge across the river? I had a copy of my grandmother Hayden's letters describing trying to get across that river horseback. It was flooded, so finally someone took the horses across and the people rode across in cable cars that they pulled by hand over the river. My grandmother, Betty Hayden, was accompanying her husband, the vice governor of the Philippines, Joseph Ralston Hayden, on an official visit up into these mountains to talk to the village people. My grandmother was always greeted by children carrying flowers who did dancing and singing for them. And then the vice governor would give a little talk. He would ask the people what they wanted. They always wanted more medical supplies from the Americans, which they didn't have, and they also wanted to pay less taxes. The taxes were not paid in cash, they were paid in labor. And the labor tax was 15 days a year working on roads, and they only wanted to work 10 days a year on the roads. And then her husband, Joseph Ralston, would address their needs and talk to them some more. And my grandmother wrote in her letters, it sounded like a lot of hooey to me. Oh, and here comes the jeepney up the road. We rode in one going up. We are just walking down the street back to Bontoc, seeing the sights. We passed the cemetery. It's difficult to bury people in this ground, so they have crypts above ground. From Bontoc, we got a jeepney ride up to the town of Sagada. We spent 3 nights here, and we went to the caves. It was a great experience. There were no safety measures in this cave. It was left totally natural for that natural experience. It was warm for a cave. At one point, we just took off our shoes because it's like sandstone, and so your feet grip even though it's wet. That's my son with me, and we hired a guide. You have to go in with a guide. All the formations have names, and this one is the Queen Mother about to give birth, of course. Our guide took so many pictures, he just got a hold of my iPhone and snapped all the pictures for me. So before we were finished, as we were going out, our guide asked me how old I was. I said, I'm 69 years old. And he said, you are the oldest person I've taken in these caves. We came down those cliffs in that narrow opening behind us, not even on steps. We just kind of slithered down there, and I was wondering how we were going to get out of here. And this is as far as we went in the cave, and you can see behind us the cave goes for miles. But we're stopping here. Oh, this is how we get out. You see how wet my shirt is? There was water running over these rocks. And then there are steps and handrails when you come out of that cave. It was a thrilling experience. It's a beautiful cave. It's massive. It was really fun.
Ma'am, sorry the video.
And here's our guide with his kerosene lamp. They're only allowed to take kerosene lamps in here. We saw a lot of these signs. Moma is the juice from the betel nut that they chew. It's like chewing tobacco. In these mountains, it's difficult to dig into the ground, so they have coffins that are carved, and then they hang and eventually disintegrate. People are buried in different caves at the mouth of the caves who have different types of deaths. These people would have been old enough to carve their own coffin. People who died in childbirth were buried in another cave. People who died of a disease or suicide were buried in different caves. Here's another banana flower. We are walking back up to the village of Sagada. There's a church here. The churches, this one is Episcopal, but the Catholic and the Episcopalians brought the idea that everybody could be buried in the same cemetery. And now they are today. This bell is dated 1921, Sagada. When you travel to a foreign country, things are, well, foreign. It costs more to poo than to pee, and you must declare before you go. This is a modern cemetery today with a veterans tomb for those who sacrificed their lives in World War II. And we walk to another valley with hanging coffins. We have a guide for all of this. You just pay them a few dollars. It helps support the economy, and they're very interesting. They are local people, of course.
Yan actually yung traditional na
The buses were very safe, they were very comfortable. Some of them had a stewardess on board who would pass out water and make sure the restroom was clean, and she was wearing a lovely uniform and pearl earrings. We would always stop for lunch and pee and poo break along the way. We had had fish soup for breakfast the morning before, and then we went to a 5-star resort at the Baguio Country Club. It was just before Christmas, but if you are wondering what the Americans were in here for, here's the story. The Baguio Country Club was founded by William Cameron Fords in 1905. It was occupied as the Japanese Officers Club in 1942 to 1944 and as the headquarters of the commanding general of the 33rd Division of the United States Armed Forces in 1945. The Americans owned and operated the gold mines, the rubber plantations, and they were the sole export receivers of many products that the United States could not get elsewhere. This was the summer palace for the Philippine government, and my grandfather, Joseph Ralston Hayden, had a summer home here from which he was taking those trips into the highlands. This is a picture of him. He was a professor of social science at the University of Michigan, specializing in Southeast Asian studies. We could go in through the gates and take pictures of the summer palace and some of the Christmas decorations. One thing that surprised me about the Philippine Islands is that they all spoke American English, and when the Japanese attacked the Philippines in 1941, there were 16,000 American troops there under General MacArthur. When he saw he couldn't defend the Philippines, he fled to Australia, leaving the general in charge to surrender on Corregidor to the Japanese. The Americans surrendered to the Japanese. And then a few years later, General MacArthur came back, and then he had to fight the Japanese again. And my father was there, and my grandfather was a civil advisor with General MacArthur. Thank you for joining me, Tyler Burgess. I hope you enjoyed this. It was a little different than my other shows with some family history.